The Free Army controls the Hanano strategic barracks in Aleppo, and the regime targets residential neighborhoods. Public executions continue in Damascus and its countryside, and more than 163 die in Syria today. Also in the news, the EU acknowledges tightening sanctions on the Syrian regime, and Canada includes the Syrian regime on the list of sponsors of terrorism. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The government forces killed at least 163 people so far, according to local coordination committees, 87 of them in Aleppo, while the Free Army took control over the strategic Hanano barracks after several massacres committed by the regime forces, where at least 30 people died in the bombing at Al-Halawaniya area. And dozens were killed and wounded in the bombing that targeted Al-Lawz marketplace in a Sha'ar neighborhood. And shells destroyed the drinking water line in the neighborhood of Al-Maidan, while the Revolution General Commission reported that 17 bodies of execution victims were found in a trench in Aleppo. 47 Syrians died today, according to the local coordination committees, mostly in Damascus and its countryside. In the meantime, violent artillery shelling has been reported in the village of Kafr Hamra, coinciding with the clashes between the Free Syrian Army and the regime forces in Al Layramoun checkpoint. And shelling renewed today on Al Maysar, Al Arqoub and Sakhur. Also, activists confirmed that the Free Army has taken full control over the violent battles at the Hanano barracks, where more than 350 prisoners were released from a secret prison in the barracks, while 35 members of the regime forces have been detained.
The province of Aleppo topped the news in the recent days. The rebels have managed, after several attempts, to control the new military checkpoints in Al Arqoub area, specifically Hanano Barrack. This barrack was the headquarters of Al-Assad regime forces. In addition to what it holds from documents and information on wanted members of the military dissidents and those who are bailed out from military service, the rebels have discovered also a secret prison that has more than 300 detainees. Several news is coming from the new neighborhoods, other than those controlled by the Free Army, as the neighborhood of Al-Midan, which is inhabited by Armenians and Arabs, and was controlled by the rebels who stormed several security points in it. Meanwhile, the local coordination committees said that an airstrike targeted the main water line in the water institution, which flooded the streets of Al-Midan and Bustan al-Basha neighborhoods. The span of control extended to Al Layramoun, there where the barrier that separates the northern countryside from the city and is close to the Air Force intelligence branch located in Zahra neighborhood, during which clashes where the rebel gained control, which led the regime's warplanes and helicopters to lift the siege of the central barrier amid reports of heavy losses incurred by the regime forces from the Free Syria Brigade. 53 days boosted the morale of the rebels in the neighborhoods that the regime had lost control of. But the loss of control led the regime to use its artillery and aircraft to destroy entire buildings, as here in the neighborhood of Al-Sha'ar, where several victims fall each day dead and wounded, as there is inadequate field hospitals to receive them, especially after the lack of medicine and medical equipments. And to that, neighborhoods such as Salah ad-Din seems empty of its inhabitants after the bombing that targeted everything in the area. But still, the regime forces couldn't enter 70% of the city, according to the rebels.
In the town of Anjara and Aleppo suburbs, the residents began operations to rebuild what has been destroyed by the military troops.
هذا المكان تعرض للقصف منذ يومين، والآن الناس يعودون لبناء هذا المكان متحدين لظروف القصف الذي تتعرض له بلدة عنجارة، ليثبتوا للنظام أنهم ثابتون وأنهم على سبيل النصر ماشون وماضون بإذن الله تعالى. حلب الريف الغربي بلدة عنجارة.
قصف الطيران الحربي على حي الشعار على سوق سد اللوز. فين الساعة 2012؟ الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر بني آدم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
And the images that we are watching right now are of the bomb that targeted Lowe's marketplace in Aleppo.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. حلب الشعار سوق سد اللوز. قصف الطيران الحربي على الحي.
A new massacre was committed by the regime forces in Damascus suburbs after executing 15 civilians in Douma. Earlier, the government troops bombed the villages and towns in Douma, Al-Ghouta al-Sharqiyya and Deir al-Asafir, where fires broke in commercial shops due to the constant bombardment of the city, while the city of Zabadani is still under mortar shelling and artillery fire. And in the town of Babilla, forces of the regime raided homes and destructed property.
Clashes escalate in Al-Tadamun neighborhood and Al Yarmouk refugee camp amid continuous shelling from the regime's artillery and aviation forces, which led to the death of dozens of civilians, mostly women and children. Al Yarmouk refugee camp is about 8 kilometers away from the center of Damascus. The camp is located in the southern part of Damascus and has the largest concentration of Palestinian refugees in Syria, while its creation goes back to the year 1957, and its inhabitants are not confined to the Palestinian refugees only, but also include a large number of Syrians from the poor class. The neighborhood of Al-Tadamun, which is adjacent to the Palestinian camp, is also being subjected to heavy shelling. The neighborhood is inhabited by citizens from various cities in Syria and has high population density. Both neighborhoods share the same suffering since their inception in a random manner, along with the lack of services. And Al-Hajar al-Aswad, which is inhabited by Syrians from the occupied Golan, also shares Al-Tadamun and Al Yarmouk their suffering. The dwellers of the mentioned neighborhoods rebelled shortly after the beginning of the revolution in Damascus and other Syrian cities, where Al-Assad regime forces suppressed these demonstrations by military operations that have resulted in hundreds of dead and wounded civilians, along with the humanitarian crisis that is suffered by most of the neighborhoods in Damascus, including Al-Qadam and Berze, and several other towns and villages in rural Damascus, which were also subjected to military operations that were described as the most brutal in recent months, particularly in Daraya, Mu'addamiyat al-Sham, Jdaidat Artuz, and Saqba. The city's neighborhoods and suburbs of Damascus are today in front of the scene of bombing and killing, along with continuous massacres and arrests, amid international and global silence and front what the oldest city in human civilization is facing.
The state forces have ravaged Aqraba and Babila in Damascus suburbs, where the bodies of 4 people were found in Al-Mu'addamiyah. All this happened amid the intensified hovering of warplanes, and especially in the neighborhood of Al-Tadamun, where the columns of smoke were seen rising as a result of the bombing. Also in Al-Tadamun, activists reported that the regime's forces stormed Al-Basil hospital and arrested a number of wounded victims, while a Sham network reported that the Free Syrian Army shot down a plane that was bombing the neighborhood. And Orient News has also received a video that shows members of the Free Syrian Army moving in the neighborhood, and also shows some of the clashes that took place there.
جراح بدي لك ساقط طالع بوجوهها بقبض
بخفي له وش بضبشه
لا
بضبشه
And to know more about the situation in the capital, we speak to Suzanne Ahmed, an activist from Damascus suburbs. Suzanne, can you hear me? Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Suzanne, can you give us more about the situation in the capital, especially regarding the situation in the suburbs of the capital?
Actually, more killed people in the new massacres were perpetrated today by Assad's forces. We have 56 killed people in Damascus suburbs, 28 in Damascus, where 13 of them were judicially executed in Tadamun, 5 in Hajar al-Aswad, 2 in Kafr, 1 in Al-Qadam, 1 in Al-Midan, 2 in Mukhayyam al-Yarmouk, 3 in Jober, and 1 in Shaghud. Assad's forces continue committing more crimes, killing Hajar al-Aswad, Al-Asali, Yarmouk camp, and Kafr Sousa orchards amid intensive gunfire. Moreover, Tadamun is witnessing a violent attack. It's being shelled with artillery, and many houses were burned due to heavy shelling. In addition to that, Assad's forces stormed Al-Basil hospital there and arrested a number of injured people and stormed a neighborhood near Al-Zubayr Mosque, and there are fears of perpetrating a massacre. 2 explosions heard in Al-Kabun amid heavy gunfire. We got to know that many were injured and some of them are in a critical situation. Assad's forces raided Rukn-ud-Din, storming many houses and arresting a big number of young men. As for Damascus suburbs, there are 12 people who were extrajudicially executed in Douma. One of them is a defected soldier. There are 4 killed in Mu'adiyah and 3 in Malta also executed with marks of torture. Jdeid Artouz is being shelled now, and Assad's forces are raiding the area with a big number of fully armed soldiers. Biha, Babila, Sidi Miqdad, Beit Sahab, and Akraba are being stormed into as well. Zabadani is being shelled for the 46th day. A big number of civilians got injured, and a very bad humanitarian situation was reported. The tanks are targeting residential houses in Hosh Arab now, and people are really intimidated, and there are fears of perpetrating a new massacre there.
So then what about the clashes between the Free Syrian Army and the government forces, specifically in Al-Tadamun?
Yeah, actually members of the Free Syrian Army are just trying to protect civilians in Tadamun, so they got to clash with the Assad's forces. You know, the Free Syrian Army is always available in hot areas, trying to protect civilians, trying to help and to just take injured people to hospitals and to provide some medical care. But still, Assad's forces are targeting everything: residential houses, civilians, children, and women.
Suzanne, I want to ask you about the bombing, or actually the targeting of Al-Basil hospital in Damascus. Was it filled with injured victims? Was it filled with, or was it an empty hospital?
No. Honestly, there were many injured people. Some of them were really in a very critical situation. They went there thinking that it is a safer place, or it could be a safer place, seeking a medical help. But unfortunately, Assad's forces raided the hospital, arrested many wounded people, humiliated others, and even assaulted many people there and injured people there.
Suzanne Ahmed, an activist from Damascus suburbs, thank you so much for being with us and for your valuable input. Coming up later in the bulletin, the Syrian regime shells Iraqi territories, killing a little girl and wounding 4. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. To Daraa, where Al-Assad regime forces killed 7 people while shelling continued on the towns of Tafas, Sil, and Khil in the countryside of the city, in conjunction with the beginning of the raids and arrests that targeted the towns of Namr al-Hara, and meanwhile shelling renewed on the towns of Enkhil and Busra al-Sham, where the regime forces targeted the city's archaeological neighborhoods. In the meantime, that also happened in Khirbet Ghazale, which witnessed the arrival of new military reinforcements on the international highway of Damascus-Amman, as residents of Dar al-Mahatta mourned yesterday 2 victims who were killed by the regime forces. The neighborhoods of Jawbar al-Sultaniya and Bab Amr Homs came under heavy bombardment from the military academy, and the regime's barriers scattered around these neighborhoods. In the countryside of Rastan, Al-Qusayr, Qalat al-Hasn, Al-Buwaida al-Sharqiyya witnessed heavy shelling from helicopters and rocket launchers that led to the demolition of several houses and the fall of many casualties. This is while the city of Homs is experiencing a bad health and living situation because of the siege of more than 3 months. In Hama, the cities of Al-Latamina and Kafr Zita in the countryside witnessed artillery shelling from the regime forces, which led to the fall of a number of wounded civilians. And in the city of Hama, the regime forces stormed using civilian vehicles the neighborhoods of Tariq al-Bab, Gharb al-Mashtal, At-Tatan, and it cut all roads leading to these neighborhoods. This coincided with a campaign of raids and arrests, and gunfire and explosions were heard in both neighborhoods from the southern areas. Field hospitals failed to treat the wounded civilians in Idlib as they fall due to the military operations launched by the regime forces in the province of Idlib. The lack of medical supplies comes as the series of shelling continues on the town and villages also in the province, while increasing numbers of wounded civilians.
The regime's military operations escalate on the city of Idlib and its surroundings, which increases the number of injured civilians as it's difficult to reach hospitals because of the violent shelling of houses and mosques, where citizens volunteer to facilitate the treatment of the injured civilians. The medical tools, the least we can say about them is their simplicity, but they are adequate in these events. On another aspect, fierce military campaigns continue, where Al-Assad regime forces do not hesitate to burn houses and their property, as what happened in the village of Hibsini in Harim. This is in addition to the artillery and rocket bombardment that targeted the villages of Al-Zawiya mountain, as in Ihsam, Al-Rami and Blashun. The same thing repeated in Taftanaz, Kafar Sinji and Sarmada, where the regime forces imposed security cordon and a blockade on Ariha and Jisr Shughur. Military operations enhanced by snipers spreaded on the hills surrounding Asqat town in rural northern area, which coincided with the recruitment of tanks towards Asqat junction amid citizens' fears of storming the town.
آثار القصف بالهاون على بلدة سقاط.
In Deir ez-Zor, the regime forces shelled several neighborhoods in the city, including the neighborhood of Al-Huwaiqa, which has been bombed with MiG warplanes that fired missiles next to Al-Wahda church. And in the countryside, the regime forces continued shelling the cities and towns of Al-Bukamal, Shhil, Muhassan that targeted houses of civilians and led to many casualties and material damage. The shelling also targeted the nearby villages of Jidat al-Bakara in the city. Coming up in the bulletin, the Syrian regime shells Iraqi territories, killing a little girl and wounding 4. The German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle said today that it is time to increase the pressure on the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Speaking during a news conference in the Jordanian capital Amman, Westerwelle said that it is necessary that we isolate the regime of al-Assad.
It is necessary that we isolate the regime of Assad. We will use the next weeks while Germany has the presidency in the Security Council in New York to work on this isolation and to increase the pressure to this regime of Bashar al-Assad. We think that
the foreign ministers of the European Union agreed on the need to tighten sanctions on the Syrian regime at the end of their meeting in the resort of Markulis in Cyprus. The High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union, Catherine Ashton, stressed the need to support the efforts of the Special Envoy Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi, the joint United Nations and the Arab League envoy to Syria, and said that the Security Council is unable at this time to move forward in the Syrian issue, which requires the EU to coordinate efforts on both the diplomatic and humanitarian levels, as well as support the Syrian opposition to unite and put a viable plan for the future of Syria, as she put it.
Several times a week to continue to discuss what we do.
The Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister John Bird announced today that Canada has listed both Iran and Syria as states that support terrorism. And he added that Canada is committed to fighting global terrorism and to holding perpetrators of terrorism and those who provide them support accountable for their actions. An Iraqi security source said that a little girl was killed and 4 were wounded by mortar shells fired from the Syrian territory on the border area. The French news agency quoted Captain Ali Jouer from the Iraqi army as saying that these shells fell after 11 on Friday evening, while Dr. Mustafa Shawki confirmed that the hospital he works at received the little girl's body and the 4 wounded victims are being treated from injuries that were caused by the shell. Politically, the representative of the United Nations and the Arab League envoy to Syria, Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi, is going to hold tomorrow in Cairo talks with the Arab League officials before visiting Damascus in the following days. The spokesman of the Ibrahimi, Ahmed Fawzi, said that the agreements or arrangements underway for the upcoming visit to Damascus, saying that it will take place quickly once all the details are completed. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia will urge the UN Security Council to approve the Geneva Agreement on the principle of a political transition in Syria during a scheduled meeting this month. And on the sidelines of the annual summit of the Economic Cooperation Forum, Lavrov said that there was a project to hold a special meeting of the UN Security Council with the participation of ministers on the Syrian issue. To that, Lavrov stressed that the US sanctions imposed on Syria and Iran will damage the economic interests of Russia. The British Foreign Secretary William Hague said that the European countries cannot provide any military assistance to the Syrian rebels because of the European ban on the exports of weapons to Syria. Hague said during a press conference ahead of a meeting of European officials in Cyprus that there must be a political solution to the crisis in Syria. From her part, Catherine Ashton said that the use of the Syrian regime of weapons against the opposition is shameful. She also said in remarks to the press in Cyprus that the violence in Syria must stop. And before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. Free Syrian Army controls the Hanano strategic barracks in Aleppo, and the regime targets residential neighborhoods.
حصل على حيل تضامن على إحياء الدمشقية 8/9/2012.
Public executions continue in Damascus and its countryside, and more than 172 die in Syria today. And the EU acknowledges tightening sanctions on the Syrian regime, and Canada includes the Syrian regime on the list of sponsors of terrorism. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching.